The subject of Chapter 7 is communication. Communication is a part of every step in the management process. This communication that we'll talk about throughout the chapter includes verbal communication and nonverbal communication. And one of the chapter goals is to provide techniques for communicating more effectively. Communication, again, is an integral part of management. Communication is transmitting a message from a sender to a receiver. The average person spends about 70% of his or her waking hours in some form of communication, whether it's writing, reading, speaking, or listening. So it's important to look at how we can improve our communication. There are many things that can interfere with communication. Interference is anything that distorts or interrupts a message or some form of communication. Communication also includes interpreting things that come from others. So when we send a message to another individual, they have to interpret our message. Effective communication occurs when the receiver interprets the sender's message in the same exact way that the speaker intended it to. Communication is related to personal resource management as well as business management. For example, communication is important for job interviews. It's important in your job itself. It's important for personal relationships. We use communication daily, and it's a big part of our relationships with other people. Communication includes channels, noise, and setting. We'll start off talking about channels and setting. A channel is a method by which communication travels from the source or the sender to the receiver. The channel can be written words, verbal communication, nonverbal communication. For example, you can say yes by saying yes using the words, or say yes nonverbally by nodding your head, and then the receiver understands what you mean. Conversations and communication are different depending on the setting. The setting is the physical surroundings where the communication is taking place. For example, your communication in a crowded bar versus your communication in an empty hallway will be very different. There are appropriate places for certain types of communication, and it's important to be sensitive to the setting in order to be an effective communicator. You want to take account of the setting whenever you're choosing your communication and the words you say. Noise, as we're talking about it here, is very obvious. Noise is defined as interference that prevents from hearing a message correctly. A quiet setting allows senders and receivers to concentrate on each other, whereas a noisy setting is full of distractions, whether they're from external noise or internal noise. External noise is the sounds coming from the environment. It might be an airplane in the sky, blinding sun, howling wind, or lightning, while internal noise is that's in the sender's or the receiver's mind. If the person speaking is daydreaming or thinking about something other than the conversation, that's going to cause interference within the communication, and the same thing with the receiver. The receiver is not going to hear it the same way if they're daydreaming or thinking about something else other than what the speaker is saying. This often occurs whenever a word or something we're talking about in the conversation clicks with something else in our mind, and it makes us start to think about something else that's related to that in some way. And this noise can occur at any point in the communication process. This is a diagram of the communication process model. You can see that the setting is kind of encompassing the entire model. The setting is where the communication is taking place. The source or the sender encodes a message where it's the process of putting their thoughts, ideas, or information into a symbolic form, that they choose some form of channel to send the message through. The receiver or listener then has to decode that communication, where decoding involves the process by which the receiver assigns meaning to the symbols that were sent by the source or the sender, whether it's assigning meaning to words on a paper or the words coming out of their mouth or some other form of symbol. Feedback is ongoing throughout the process, and there are varying levels of noise in that setting, whether it's internal noise or external noise. Communication is a two-way process between a sender and a receiver. Sending involves saying what you want to say and having agreement between your verbal and nonverbal messages. If you're saying one thing, but your facial expressions and your body language indicate the opposite of what your words are saying, the receiver can become confused, and this leads to miscommunication. For example, if you're telling somebody you're sorry with words, but your face and your body language indicate that you're not sorry, the receiver is probably not going to believe your message or be confused by your message. Receiving a message involves listening to the verbal messages and observing nonverbal messages. If the message is getting through to the receiver, if the person you're talking to understands your message, it's generally shown in their facial expressions. In some cases, you can see if you're explaining something to somebody, you can see the confusion in their facial expressions. We're usually senders and receivers at the same time. It's not simply one person being the sender and one person as the receiver. It's not as simple as one person speaking and the other listening. In most conversations, we're both sending messages and receiving messages intermittently, or sometimes even if you interrupt somebody, it might be at the same time. And in some cases, you have multiple listeners. If you're giving a speech, for example, group lectures, there's one sender of a message and multiple receivers. Senders and receivers use 4 communication functions. The first is encoding. This is the process of putting your thoughts or ideas into symbolic form, whether that symbol is a written word, spoken words, sign language. There are many different types of symbols or symbolic forms that you can use. Decoding is the process of the receiver assigning meaning to those symbols. So if you're reading a textbook that's written in English, you can assign meaning to those words. If you don't speak English and you're looking at a textbook written in English, you're not going to understand what those symbols mean. Responses are the individual reactions following the message. If you're in a conversation with another person, their response to what you say would obviously be the response. And feedback is the total response pattern between the sender and receiver, what's going on between these two people. Listening is a crucial part of the communication process. In a lot of families, one of the bigger problems that people complain about is that other people in the family not listening to them. There are a variety of ways that we listen. First, critical listening is where we listen in order to evaluate or challenge or judge some message. This is the type of listening we use when we are observing a political candidate or a commercial. We're looking at it whether we can believe the message. We question the message sender's motives, the validity of their ideas, whether they're providing fact or fiction, and we judge the message and the sender itself as a result of the critical listening. Reflective or empathetic listening is where we set aside our own feelings and try to enter into the feelings of the person talking. We identify with their emotions, we listen for details, we might paraphrase or mirror what they're saying. If they say something, you might try to kind of summarize what they're saying and say that back to them. You're helping the person work through the problem that they have. In order to acquire knowledge, we use informational listening. We would use this type of listening when watching the news or listening to a lecture, for example. And then the fourth type of listening is for pleasure, where we are listening just for enjoyment or satisfaction. This is the type of listening we use when we're watching television, when we're listening to music, listening to a child laughing, or talking to your friend on the telephone. Listeners use certain gestures or mannerisms to communicate their interest in the message. Some examples of this are leaning forward rather than back, nodding when the person's talking to show that you understand what they're saying, smiling at the speaker, making eye contact. If you're ever giving a lecture and if you're a teacher or a professor and you see the students, there are certain ways you can look at the audience and tell whether they're paying attention to the message, whether they're into the message or not. Symbols are a big part of communication. They suggest something to the person viewing the symbol, and that's through association. Some of the different kinds of symbols are first visible symbols. An engagement ring is a symbol of the intention to marry. It's something that you see, and seeing that ring communicates to you that that person is going to be married. Abstract symbols represent ideas. For example, these two signs that are the signs for gender, male and female, when we see these signs, we know what they mean. Verbal symbols are simply words. The words that we say mean something to the person listening to them if they know that language. And nonverbal symbols are anything that's not words or actions, including works of art. A siren is a nonverbal symbol. Train whistles, our clothing is a nonverbal symbol. The facial expressions that we make, our gestures, our posture, and so on are all examples of nonverbal symbols. Communication experts estimate that as much as 93% of the messages that are sent and received are made up of these nonverbal symbols. So in a lot of cases, it's not what you say, but how it's said, and all of the things that are around the verbal symbols that you're giving to another person. Some of the different parts of nonverbal communication are first artifacts. This is the type or placement of objects around a person. If you're sitting in the library and somebody comes in and sits down at a desk and then spends 20 minutes to arrange their belongings, they take out their laptop, set it up, take out pens and pencils, set them out, get their cell phone, put it in a specific place. That communicates something to you. That's very different than how you would view somebody who came into the library, sat down, threw their bag on a desk, and started working. Proxemics is referring to the distance between speakers. If you're really close to somebody in terms of distance and you're whispering to each other, that implies a type of relationship to the people observing it. Distance and yelling at somebody, that implies something else to the people observing it. The proxemics also include touching behavior. Whether you shake hands with somebody, hug them, that communicates something to them as well as the people observing. Body language is the posture that we have, our movements. And in an interview, this is particularly important. There are a lot of suggestions that experts give for things to do in interviews and things not to do in terms of body language. One example of body language is crossing your arms. A lot of people think this means that you're closing yourself off to other people. Physical characteristics are another form of nonverbal communication. This includes the size, posture, and shape of a person's body. One example of this is if some guy looks like he's in extremely good shape, we would assume that he exercises. The shape of his body would communicate to us some activity that he's involved with. Clothes and adornment or grooming, these are all different things that are nonverbal communication. This includes hairstyles, jewelry, cosmetics, whether you use cologne or perfume. The clothes we wear and the styles we follow and the way we groom our hair or the way we style our hair, these all communicate to other people things about us. Touching behavior is another type of nonverbal communication. This involves how you shake hands with another person, whether you hug everybody, if you crack your knuckles when you're sitting around, if you tap your feet, any different things like this communicate to other people something about you. Without you even saying any words, you are communicating to other people. A message is the total communication sent, listened to, and received. Verbal messages or verbal communication can be defined or divided into two different types. There are you messages and I messages. The you messages are those that often you are blaming another person, judging that other person. In personal and professional relationships, these can lead to the other person being offended, and then they become defensive and the statement can lead to conflict. A better way to communicate is through I messages, and this is where you express how you feel or think about an issue instead of placing blame on the judgment or calling them out. So if, for example, you were trying to change the way you sent your message from a you message to an I message, rather than saying you never do anything around here, you might stop and think about how that would make the listener or receiver of the message feel and how you could state it better in order to not offend them. And perhaps rather than saying you never do anything around here, you could say, by replacing with an I message, I like it when you help me with the dishes, if that's what you were communicating about. Message construction includes where information should be placed in a message in order to have maximum impact. The communicator has to decide whether to place the main point of their message, for example, in a speech, whether they place it at the beginning of the speech or whether they place it at the end. And it's something in larger issues where you have to communicate something or present something to other people, something that you should think about where to place important information in order to have the most effect or the greatest effect. A channel, again, is the method by which communication travels from the source or the sender to the receiver. There are several different channels for communicating. One channel is the direct channel. This is where there is face-to-face talking. In this case, you have the advantage of seeing how the other person is reacting to your message, and so then there's less chance for miscommunication. The indirect channel is mass communication, such as the radio, television, magazines, newspapers, signs on the side of the road. In this case, everyone gets the same message, is sent the same message, but each individual or receiver of the message interprets it in his or her own way. Social channels are those where we have close proximity with the person and usually have direct communication. The social channel is, for example, with friends, neighbors, family members. we generally have direct communication with these people and we're in close proximity. We're close to these people. These most likely include face-to-face contact as well. The advocate or expert channel is a less direct form of communication. Some examples of advocates or experts would be salespeople or the organization PETA, People with a Cause. With these individuals or groups, you're more likely to have less direct forms of communication. For example, you might be observing a speech from some expert, but you could also have direct or face-to-face communication with these people. If you were working with a financial planner, that would be a face-to-face. You would be meeting face-to-face and it would be a direct channel. Communication style is an individual's preferred way to communicate. Communication style is closely tied to your personality, your family background, the culture that you come from, and also your past experiences. The three broad communication styles that are talked about by experts are passive, assertive, and aggressive. The passive communication style is where you put the rights of others before your own. The assertive communication style is where you stand up for your own rights but also respect the rights of others. And then the aggressive is where you stand up for your rights, but as you're doing that, you're violating the rights of others. It's rare that a person is all in one of these categories. People are more likely to have a mix of 2 or even 3 of these communication styles, and they will also vary by situation. The communication style that's viewed as being best in general is assertive, where you're standing up for your own rights, but you're also respecting the rights of others. But there are cases when having the other features is good. For example, if an issue is minor, or if the problems that are caused by a conflict are greater than the conflict itself, then in this case, having a passive communication style isn't all that bad. If you're fighting about something as simple as where to put a certain item in the fridge or in the cupboard, that's something where being passive wouldn't be so bad. In terms of being aggressive, this is good during emergencies. This is a person with this communication style in an emergency situation would take charge of the situation without stopping to ask others what they thought. In order to have a better or to improve your communication style, you might want to think about which of these categories you fall into. And if you're always passive, maybe think about ways to stop being always passive, or if you're aggressive, to think of ways to kind of be more considerate of the rights of others. Communication conflicts are fairly common within families, in workplaces, and communication conflict also often occurs across cultures where people from one culture don't understand the people of another culture, and it's more of a miscommunication rather than there being an actual problem. Conflict refers to a state of disagreement. Conflict can pose a threat to relationships, and it can occur from miscommunication or misunderstandings, or just simply having poor communication between two individuals or more people. Conflict resolution is where you go through negotiations to remedy the conflict, whether it's to improve communication or to make changes that one person or both people feel is necessary. Conflict is common in families because families are so intimate. They're always together. It's many years that they're together. It's more on the surface and less hidden because you know your family members well enough to know to see their nonverbal communication and understand it. You might see, for example, your sister or brother and know that they're upset just by their face, whereas if it was just a friend who you've known for a year, you might not know that. And so the conflict might not come to the surface. It might stay. You might not actually deal with the conflict and tell that person how you feel, or they might not tell you how they feel. And the number of conflicts, or the possibility of conflicts, increases as the number of people in the family increases. And this is because adding a second child to a family, if it's a family of two parents and one child, and then you're adding that second child, it increases the number of interactions that are happening, and therefore there's more chance for conflict. Some different types of communication conflicts are first interpersonal conflicts. These are where the actions of one person interfere with the actions of another person in some way. This can occur at many different levels of interaction. It can occur at work, it can happen with your friends, within your families, and with a boyfriend or girlfriend or some partner. An example of an interpersonal conflict: if your boyfriend or girlfriend doesn't want you to go out with your friends, and so because there's a fight, if you do go with them, you don't go out with your friends. That's an example of an interpersonal conflict. Destructive conflicts are where it's a specific type of interpersonal conflict where there are direct verbal attacks on another individual. So whereas in the simple interpersonal conflict, you might just not go out with your friends because your boyfriend or girlfriend had a problem with it. In this case, there would be yelling, screaming, and it would be destructive and not constructive. Constructive conflicts are those that focus on the issue or the problem rather than on the other person's deficits. The constructive conflicts can help to open up issues and lead to deeper relationships. It can help you clarify certain things within relationships and can also help you to better understand another person. If you sit down and think about the issue or the problem itself rather than the other person, you might be able to better understand where that person's coming from and vice versa. It's important to remember that even though the word conflict has a negative connotation with it, not all conflicts are negative. Sometimes conflict is necessary for resolution, but the important thing is to focus on the issue or the problem rather than a person. Researchers generally agree that men and women communicate differently in terms of both verbal communication and nonverbal communication. One example is that men speak more in classrooms and in meetings compared to women. At the same time, women speak more words throughout a day. Typically, or on average, women speak about 25,000 words throughout a day, whereas men only speak about 10,000 words throughout the day. In general, women are more comfortable talking about personal matters with their family and friends in comparison to men who would rather perhaps not talk about those things. Some other differences are in terms of how men and women express problems and how they seek information. In a lot of cases, women resent how men tend to offer a solution to a problem whenever they're complaining about something. Whenever women are complaining about something, women want to talk about the problems. It's part of how they deal with these issues, whereas men don't want to do the same thing. They just see it as, well, it's a problem, here's the solution, and then move on. These differences between men and women have implications for spouses and families. It's important to understand and appreciate the different forms of communication and to understand that not every person communicates in the same way that you do. From one culture to another, there are many different ways of communicating, and these differences in communication are part of the reason between some of the conflict that arises between cultures and the different styles of communication. American culture, for example, influences how Americans converse, and one researcher found that Americans are so direct in conversations that people from other nations sometimes think of Americans as being naive or childlike. These other nations, their style is maybe to be more indirect with their communication, but this indirectness or hidden agendas can make Americans uneasy. So misunderstandings can come from failing to understand these other cultures' values, decision patterns, symbols, and spoken and nonverbal languages. One example is the slogan, "Come alive with Pepsi." That becomes, "Pepsi brings your ancestors back from the grave" in Chinese, and "Come alive out of the grave" in German. So there are just differences in communication, and this is what leads to misunderstandings from one place to another. It's important to remember this in the business world, as well as when you're working with individuals from other cultures. Social space also varies by culture and also by relationships within cultures. In the United States, intimate space is less than 18 inches. There are few people who we allow to enter this space. If you think about somebody who's ever kind of come too close to you, perhaps a teacher who came too close to you while they were talking and you kind of back away from them. There are different levels of space that we feel comfortable with. Personal space for Americans is about 1.5 to 4 feet, and American culture kind of goes along with strangers not invading the space of 4 feet. They should stay at least 4 feet away from you. Americans conduct business in the social zone of 4 to 7 feet, and then the public zone is 12 to 15 feet. In Latin America and the Middle East, people tend to get much closer. In business meetings, this might make some Americans uncomfortable. It's important to think about how you react when somebody gets closer than you would like, to think about their culture and where they're coming from, because if you were to back away from them, this would communicate something to them, and they might misinterpret you backing away and think that you're being cold or that they might think something about you that would keep them from doing business with you. So culture is important to consider when you're communicating in international business. But even as the United States becomes more diverse, it's important because it's likely that you'll be working with coworkers and clients who are from other cultures. And it's important to remember or to understand or think about where they're coming from, and that all communication is not exactly the same as your style and your culture's style.